Hello and welcome to the Irish History Show on Near FM. My name is Cathal Brennan, and on this episode, myself and my co-presenter John Dorney are going to talk about the Seán Hales assassination. If you want to listen to previous episodes of the show, go to our website, irishhistoryshow.ie, like us on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show, or Twitter @IrishHistoryPod. So John, we recently had an anniversary there, which was the Seán Hales assassination. Now, could you give us an idea who Seán Hales was?
Yeah, so Seán Hales, the TD who was assassinated on December 7th, 1922, was a prominent member of the Republican movement. He came from a very distinguished family of West Cork Republicans, so his brother Tom Hales was also a leading IRA figure in West Cork, in the 3rd Cork Brigade of the IRA, also in Sinn Féin. The Hales family were the mainstays, really, of the volunteers in the early days of the volunteer movement down in West Cork. During the Easter Rising, they were arrested. Seán escaped arrest initially. He was later found by the police and he was interned in Fangach in Wales. They came back and they organised, in a way typical of volunteers around the country, land agitation. They organised resistance to conscription. They organised Sinn Féin for the election of 1918. And they organised the volunteers who, after the election of the Dáil and the declaration of the Irish Republic, became the Irish Republican Army, the IRA. Seán was the head of the brigade initially. He kind of fell out of active service, if you like, as the War of Independence went on. His brother Tom was captured and badly tortured by the Essex Regiment, by the British Army in Bandon. Seán, interestingly, in some of his obituaries, mistakenly said he was present at engagements like the Upton ambush and the Crossbarry ambush. Actually, he was not. By that time, the active service unit, the flying column of the 3rd Brigade in Cork, was commanded by Tom Barry. But Seán Hales remained a prominent figure. At the time of the treaty split, Tom Hales, who was the more active brother up until his capture in July 1920, took the anti-treaty side. Seán took the pro-treaty side. Now, like many pro-treaty figures, not because of any tendency towards moderation, but more because he was within the orbit of Michael Collins. And Collins' great strength, his magnetic personality, pulled in a lot of the people around him. Seán Hales was one of those people. So Hales was actually on the run from the anti-treaty side. I'm not sure if his life was in danger, but he was one of a minority of Cork pro-treaty Republicans, pro-treaty IRA men, and he joined the National Free State Army when they arrived in Cork at the landings on the Cork coast in August 1922. And while there were actually very few Cork men in the National Army initially, Seán Hales became a brigadier in the National Army, and he led troops in Cork. He had been elected as a TD, a pro-treaty TD, in the election of June 1922. So by late 1922, Seán Hales was attending the Dáil in Dublin. He was still wearing the uniform of the National Army, but he doesn't seem to have had an active command in the National Army. The Dáil met for the first time during the Civil War in September 1922, and it met quite regularly thereafter. Seán Hales seems to have been in Dublin quite a lot. So Seán Hales was actually very well regarded within the IRA, including the Anti-Treaty IRA, partly because his brother Tom was a leading figure in the Anti-Treaty IRA in Cork. Also, his other brother Dáil was an envoy for the Republican side in Italy, in Europe, but specifically in Italy, and he had been before the truce as well. So Hales was not a particular anti-treaty hate figure, not by no means. Unlike others like, say, Richard Mulcahy or other IRB men like Dermot O'Hegarty or Garrett O'Sullivan, people the anti-treaty has blamed for the Civil War, what they thought of as an IRB clique. Seán Hales wasn't part of that clique. But as we'll see, he was basically in the wrong place at the wrong time.
So that period now that we're talking about, when Hales is assassinated in December 1922, how intense is the fighting in Dublin?
Okay, so by this period in Dublin, and you see this around the country, the pro-treaty side, the National Army, was getting on top of the anti-treaty guerrillas. There was a number of major attacks in Dublin in November, in the previous month, an attack in Wellington Barracks where 18 soldiers were shot. Not all of them were killed, but quite a number shot. There were 2 attacks on the CID headquarters at Oriel House. The CID was the detective division, including an attempt to blow it up, with a substantial force of anti-treatyites attacking it. There was an assassination attempt on Richard Mulcahy at his residence at Portobello Barracks in Rathmines. It was of considerable intensity. There would have been street ambushes daily. But by this period, as I said, the pro-treatyites were beginning to get on top by weight of numbers, by constant attrition of arrests. And Liam Lynch, who was the IRA Chief of Staff, Anti-Treaty IRA Chief of Staff, had switched from kind of a military campaign by this point to like an economic campaign. So he'd issued orders that they were to stop people paying tax to the Free State. They were to fine people who did pay tax to the Free State. They were to assassinate people who collected tax for the Free State. They were to burn down income tax offices. So a lot of the IRA strategy switched from like more military attacks to more kind of economic attacks, burning down offices, burning down infrastructure, wrecking roads, wrecking bridges. But the key background to the Hales assassination is the government, in response really to this kind of ongoing endemic guerrilla warfare, they passed the Public Safety Act, so-called, and we can get into the legalities of that later if you like. Passed the Public Safety Act in the Dáil in September 1922. It came into force in October, actually, but the first executions under it, the Public Safety Act allowed for the executions of anti-treaty fighters captured after that date. So the first executions were in Dublin in November. There were 3 men executed in Kilmainham, 3 young men, followed by Erskine Childers, who was executed in Beggars Bush Barracks, and then another 4 anti-treatyites executed after that. So there's 8 executions have taken place in quick succession in Dublin. And this is the really key background behind the assassination of Seán Hales, because Liam Lynch, who's the Chief of Staff of the Anti-Treaty IRA, up until this point, he hasn't authorised political assassinations. He says he instructed his fighters that you can't kill people who were alleged informers, as we did before the truce, he said, against the British. He said that was a different war. He said we can't shoot off-duty soldiers, which again they did before the truce, and you can't kill political figures. Now this all changed. After the executions, Lynch issues general orders that members of the murder gang, so this is pro-treaty soldiers who've killed prisoners, are to be assassinated. Members who voted for the murder bill, so TDs who voted for the Public Safety Act, they're to be assassinated. Their houses are to be burnt down. He issued really harsh orders in reprisal. Now the other key background is the Anti-Treaty IRA in Dublin, they suffered a lot of blows throughout the Civil War, and in one way they never really got going because they lost probably half their strength in the first couple of weeks of the war at the forecourts and the battle afterwards, where a lot of people were imprisoned. Up to 500 were imprisoned. And then at what they called the Bridges job in August 1922, they lost another maybe 150, maybe more, captured in an attempt to destroy the bridges around Dublin. And there's a constant attrition of arrests afterwards, like Ó Máille, who's the head of the Eastern Division of the Anti-Treaty IRA, is captured in November. Joe O'Connor, who's the head of 3rd Brigade, which is one of the most active brigades in the city, he's captured. They're kind of trying to organise on the fly with all these arrests happening. And in the autumn and early winter of 1922, they organised an active service unit, so full-time guerrilla unit, taken from the Dublin Brigades, or Dublin Battalions, excuse me, not the Dublin Brigades. That was linked up just in December 1922 with the intelligence unit of the IRA, and it was nicknamed the Creasing Squad. Now this is a very ominous thing, because what this means is the intelligence department is going to identify people, track them. They're going to give you information to the so-called the Creasing Squad, and they're going to kill them. So this was in place by the time that Lynch issued these orders. As regards the membership of this has only very recently come to light, and it came to light in my research for my upcoming book on the Civil War in Dublin. There were mostly, according to Bill Rowe, who was the leader of the ASU, the members of the Creasing Squad, the assassination part, were mostly University College Dublin students. One of the leading members was a young man named Owen Donnelly, who had recently graduated from O'Connell Schools, so the Christian Brothers School on the north side. And he lived in the same house as Michael Carolan, Mickey Carolan, as he was known in the IRA, who was actually an IRA man from Belfast. And unlike most IRA men, he was with the anti-treaty side, but he was the IRA head of intelligence, and they lived together. They shared intelligence, and it came to them via various means. I mean, according to Bill Rowe, it came from a waitress, I believe, that Pádraig Ó Máille, who was the deputy speaker of the Dáil, the IRA Cean Comhairle, or Leas Cean Comhairle, as they're known now. I'm not sure they were using that terminology at the time. And Seán Hales had lunch every day in the Ormonde Hotel on Ormonde Quay, and then they drove by taxi, horse-drawn taxi in those days, to the Dáil, which was already in Leinster House as it is today.
Now, had Liam Lynch made these pronouncements public that the TDs who had voted for the Public Safety Act were under threat of execution?
Yes, he had. So Liam Lynch wrote to the Speaker of the Dáil, the Cean Comhairle, and he explicitly said, you must resign from the Dáil, having voted for the murder bill, retract the murder bill, or you face execution. And their publicity department had pasted up proclamations all over Dublin, saying that members of the murder gang and members of the murder members, they called them, people who had voted for the murder bill, so this is all the anti-treaty terminology, were to be killed. So it's posted up all over Dublin. He wrote a letter to the Speaker of the Dáil. So he had publicly threatened them, and now they were going to go through with it. They had the information on, particularly on Ó Máille, Pádraig Ó Máille, from the TD from Mayo, who was the deputy speaker. He was the real target of the assassination bit, actually.
Well, in your opinion, were Hales and Ó Máille reckless, or would they have believed that they probably weren't subject to an attempted assassination?
Well, I think that people didn't immediately believe Lynch. You know, I believe that people were capable of this kind of ruthlessness. And this is a kind of feature of the Irish Civil War. You see kind of an upping of the ante of viciousness, because people initially won't believe that their former comrades are capable of doing this on both sides. So initially the anti-Treatyites didn't believe the pro-Treatyites were going to go through with the executions, but they did. And in the same way, Pádraig Ó Máille and Seán Hales and the other TDs, no doubt they thought that the other side really wouldn't go through with what was known as the orders of frightfulness, Lynch's orders. And actually, if you read a lot of the IRA testimony, a lot of them were pretty squeamish about it. A lot of them did not want to go through with these orders. One other thing to note, just before we talk about the day itself, is that Seán Hales had not actually voted for the so-called murder bill for the Public Safety Act, because he wasn't in the Dáil at the time. He was in Cork at the time when the Public Safety Act went through. So it's one of the sad ironies that the only TD who was killed actually had not voted for it.
Yes, there's many sad coincidences like that with the Irish Civil War, isn't there?
Mm-hmm.
So actually, on the day of the assassination, what happened?
So, as I said, word reached the IRA people that Ó Máille and Hales had lunch in the Ormonde Hotel. They had quite a long and allegedly a liquid lunch. I mean, they went to lunch at about 12 and they emerged at nearly 3.
And could you tell people where the Ormonde Hotel is?
Yeah, so if you know O'Connell Street in central Dublin and you take a left and you walk for about 10 minutes on the North Quays, the Ormonde Hotel is still there, I believe. Or that's Ormonde Quay there. So right smack in the heart of Dublin. Walk another 10 minutes and you're at the forecourts. And the forecourts would have been in ruins at the time because of the fighting of the previous July. But it's right smack in the centre of Dublin, along the quays, along the main thoroughfares going along the river. Behind it at the time is kind of a warren of little streets. It looks very much like Owen Donnelly and another man who was unidentified. It seems to have been a two-man team. They had this information. When Ó Máille and Hales emerged from the Ormonde Hotel, they whistled for a taxi. In those days, the taxis were horse-drawn. A man named Kennedy was driving the taxi. Both of them got into the cab, and it merely so happened, that Hales was on the side of the cab that was closest to the pavement, so closest to where the gunmen approached. They approached from the direction of Cable Street, I believe. So that would have been to Hales' left and from behind him. They opened fire with pistols on the two men. They hit both of them, but Hales was mortally wounded. He was killed. Kennedy, the taxi driver, he whipped his horses. His horses broke into a run. He got as far as O'Connell Street and he realised that both of his passengers were hit. He was stopped by a Dublin policeman, a Dublin Metropolitan policeman, as they still were at the time. Meanwhile, another odd coincidence, the British Army at this point had only, I think, 9 days left before they evacuated Dublin under the terms of the treaty. But they were still there in Dublin, around 6,000 British soldiers. And it so happened that when the two gunmen struck, there was a British armoured car motoring down the quays, and they stopped. And one of the soldiers got out and he fired some shots with a handgun at the two fleeing gunmen. But he didn't hit them, they got away. People, as you can imagine, the pedestrians scattered in all directions, there was shock. But when Kennedy, the taxi driver, saw that his two charges were wounded, he drove back to the Jervis Hospital, which is not very far away. Again, if you know Dublin, you're looking at maybe a 2-minute ride, probably, on the taxi. Ó Máille was seriously wounded, but not critical, and Hales was dead on arrival.
So what was the reaction within the Irish government, the provisional Free State government this time? Yeah,
actually it had just ceased to be the provisional government, technically speaking. So under the treaty, a year and a day after the treaty, it would be the Free State government. Technicalities aside, the government were shocked. The government probably hadn't realised that the anti-treatyites, or as they call them, the irregulars, would go through with this. And basically the reaction, one thing to say, we have to read between the lines a little bit, because unlike most other cabinet discussions, the cabinet discussions on the response to the Hales assassination have all been removed from the papers, along with many of the most sensitive documents relating to the Civil War. So, reading between the lines and going on things like Ernest Blythe's witness statement to the Bureau of Military History, the government decided that they needed the strongest possible reprisal, because they figured if the anti-treatyites had a prolonged assassination campaign, that their government would collapse, that the Free State would be finished. and everything that they fought for as they sought to create an independent Irish state would collapse. So they saw this as a real crisis moment. They were probably quite right in that regard, in a strictly tactical sense.
But I wonder as well what type of effect that had on the morale of backbench pro-treaty TDs.
Well, indeed, actually, I'll come back to that later. But they decided on the strongest possible response. So when Ernest Blythe, who was, as far as I'm aware, he's the only inside cabinet member who has left us testimony, said he wanted a mass trial of prisoners by military court-martial. But when he arrived late to the cabinet meeting, and he found that Mulcahy, I think, Richard Mulcahy, who was the Commander-in-Chief of the Army, and also the Minister for Defence, a rather unusual dual role by today's standards, had proposed to shoot 4 leading anti-treatyites without further proceedings. In response, basically, to the Seán Hales assassination, one man who had been captured in the Four Courts back at the start of the Civil War, Rory O'Connor, who had led the Four Courts takeover, Liam Mellows, who was a leading anti-treatyite. Mellows was also a member of the opposition government, the underground government the anti-treaty had set up. Joe McKelvey, who was the leading northern member of the Anti-Treaty IRA, and Dick Barrett, who was kind of a rank and file member from Cork. They were to be shot basically in reprisal. So there was no legal justification for it. They'd been captured before the legislation was passed. They couldn't be held responsible for the killing of Seán Hales. So there was no legality. It was purely a revenge killing. And it was done to shock. It was done to show that the government would hit back twice as hard. Later on, actually, one of the reasons we know Owen Donnelly was involved, we have better testimony now from the Ernie O'Malley papers, but one of the first indications was Ulrich O'Connor, the playwright, later wrote a play about this. And Sean Caffrey, who was an IRA intelligence officer in Dublin, told him Owen Donnelly was involved. And Ulrich O'Connor asked him, well, what did you think about this? And he says, there's no rules in war. The winners make the rules. Mm-hmm. The government came out on top in this competition in terror, if you like. But he's kind of right. You know, war is the opposite of rules. Mm-hmm. Just one final thing, though. Dick Barrett, it's often said that there was one shot from each province. But actually, the 3 from the Four Courts were, in modern slang, no-brainers. You know, they're the most prominent anti-treatyites they had. Dick Barrett was probably shot because he was involved in a riot a couple of weeks previously in Mountjoy, in which 3 military policemen were killed. And he's named in the Free State Inquiry as being the man behind it. The other man behind it was actually killed in the riot. So I quite suspect that's why Richard Barrett was selected. And Pádraig O'Donnell, who was in jail with them at the time in Mountjoy prison, he remembers they were taken out and nobody knew why. They were taken out early in the morning by Pádraig O'Keefe, who was the deputy governor, but the real governor of Mountjoy prison. And later on at Mass, which was the first I heard of it, the prisoners were told they had been executed, they'd been killed. And he said, a terrible silence descended on the prison. There was a number of rallies to protested the killings, and they were shot at. They were dispersed by the army. It was a very authoritarian time. One other thing in reaction though is that the anti-treaty version is that the press was totally lined up on the other side, which to a degree is true. But one thing that surprised me reading the press at the time was that actually the Irish Independent said that this is a terrible crime. The Mountjoy executions. They said this was illegal. They said this is the opposite of why we're supporting the government. We're supporting the rule of law.
Which is unusual. It's so different to the expectation you have of the newspaper coverage at the time. Yeah,
well, interestingly enough, the one that's really rabidly pro-treaty is the Freeman's Journal, which not too long afterwards merged into the Irish Independent, I believe. But the Freeman's Journal said, basically, I'm paraphrasing, but good enough for them. They had it coming kind of thing. You have to meet terror with terror, which Kevin O'Higgins later said. One other thing which is very widely known, though, which is that Kevin O'Higgins is seen as the hard man. He seems the man who was behind executions, and the ruthless, the Irish Mussolini. I think Pádraig O'Donnell tried to christen him later on. But actually, Kevin O'Higgins didn't want to approve the Mountjoy executions because his friend Rory O'Connor was among them, and Rory O'Connor had been the best man at his wedding, so one of his close friends. And he was the last to agree, and he was talked around and around. And according to Ernest Blythe, in the end, O'Higgins said, "Yeah, take them out and shoot them." I want to address your question about the backbench TDs. So, first of all, after these executions, Lynch widens the orders further. He says you're to kill members of the murder parliament, as he called it. You're to burn down their homes. You're to burn down their families' homes. You're to burn down the homes of unionists. You're to burn down the homes of the newspaper editors. They could have been more nuanced in their media strategy, actually, I think. There was no other TDs assassinated, but there was plans to kill them. It's always written, there was no more TDs killed, so they gave up on it. That's not true. The ASU and the Intelligence Department in Dublin were certainly constantly planning to kill TDs. They're constantly planning to kill the likes of Richard Mulcahy. They didn't pull it off. They did kill another pro-treaty politician, though, Seamus Dwyer, who was a prominent pro-treatyite, but he had lost his seat in the election. So, technically he wasn't a TD, but he was gunned down late in December 22, again in reprisal for the executions by a young man named Bobby Bonfield, who, like many of the assassination unit, was a UCD student, medical student. But there was a wave of house burnings, so they burned down a lot of houses of TDs and senators. The Senate opened also in late 22. It was basically an arson campaign sweeping across the country. It started in Dublin, but it spread out across the country. The backbench TDs, again, we know from Irish Blythe, a lot of backbench TDs did get them, they did get the wind up at this time, understandably enough. And Blythe tells a story of a guy named Bulfin. I'm not sure where he was the TD for, but he came in to Cosgrave, who was they didn't use the term Taoiseach at the time, they used the term president. It was the president in the government buildings in Marion Street, same place they are today. His letter came in to Cosgrave saying he was resigning in response to these threats because he feared for his life. Cosgrave dispatched men from the CID, including Joe O'Reilly, who had been a close confidant of Michael Collins, and a couple of other gunmen. The CID is the feared detective division. They took Bulfin, I'm not sure how gently, in a car, and they stopped en route to Dublin. And according to Blythe, Joe O'Reilly gets out and goes, "So, excuse my language, but I'm quoting." Joe O'Reilly says, "So, will we shoot the old bastard?" And another gunman said, "No, the boss, that's Cosgrave, told us to bring him back to Dublin." Now this, according to Blythe, this is all for show, and Blythe actually tells it as a humorous story. You can almost imagine him slapping his sides as he's saying it, but Bulfin wasn't to know this. I'm sure he was pretty traumatized by it. So according to Blythe again, Bulfin arrives in front of Cosgrave, shaking like a leaf, and Cosgrave greets him with a cigar and a handshake and says, "So, do you still want to resign?" And Bulfin says, "God, no." And he was put up for his own safety in a hotel just off Marion Square with an armed guard. So there was a number of attempts by TDs to resign in protest, and the government basically was not having it. There were hard times.
What was the feeling within the Anti-Treaty IRA to the news that Seán Hales had been assassinated?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I mentioned before, Seán Hales was actually quite well regarded. Seán Hales had not even voted for the Public Safety Act. Seán Hales had a brother, Tom Hales, and a brother, Donald Hales, prominent in the anti-treaty movement. So actually people were pretty upset, especially in Cork. They were very upset that Hales had been killed. And even the likes of Todd Andrews, who wrote a memoir about the period, said there was no use shooting decent men like Seán Hales. We should have shot the murder gang, people who were killing prisoners and so forth. Or we should have shot the members of the government, the cabinet. So people were pretty upset, actually, in the anti-treaty movement. Funny enough, Lawrence Nugent, who's an anti-treatyite in Dublin, says, he was pretty taken aback by it. He also didn't like this thing of proclamations being put up in the street threatening members of the parliament. Liam Lynch, who's the head of the IRA, and De Valera, I should say also, the political head of the anti-treatyites, didn't like it at all. But at this period, De Valera's in a kind of a wrestling match with Liam Lynch, trying to restrain him. De Valera really not keen on the Civil War, and Lynch is determined now to prosecute it to its bitter end. Lynch made an effort to kind of sell it, if you like, to the IRA. So he had a report from Frank Henderson, who by this point is the head of the Dublin Brigade of the IRA, and Henderson says, "Well, we didn't mean to kill Hales at all, we went to kill Ó Máille, and the intention was only to wound Hales." Now I find this kind of unconvincing. If you're going to shoot somebody, they're going to be most likely killed. And he says that they misidentified him. They misidentified which one was which. Now, I don't believe that personally, but that's in a report that Henderson sends to Lynch on request, and Lynch forwards to the 3rd Brigade in Cork, which is his brother Tom Hales' brigade. There's quite a bit of disquiet, actually, in the anti-treaty side. And the other thing is that, while I mentioned that the intelligence department and the assassination unit, the so-called creasing squad in Dublin, did plan more assassinations and did carry out at least one more, in the wider IRA, even in Dublin, there seems to have been a reluctance. So, for example, Seán Henderson told her in Ó Máille he could have shot various others. He could have shot Sean McGarry, for example, who was a leading IRB man and pro-treaty TD, because he was drunk every day in a pub on Amiens Street. So Frank Henderson said, and he didn't do it. And he could have shot various others, and he didn't do it. In the wider IRA, there seems to have been a certain reluctance to do it.
Well, I remember reading that part in your article in the Irish Story website, and it struck me as being incredibly reckless after the Hales assassination and after the executions of the 4 anti-treaty IRA members, that prominent pro-treaty supporters and politicians would continue to go drinking in the same spots regularly, not take those basic precautions.
It does actually, yeah. I mean, actually, one word on Sean McGarry, because he's another victim of this kind of tragic period. So, in response to the Mountjoy executions, as I said, there was an arson campaign against pro-treaty TDs, senators, supporters, newspaper people. Poor Sean McGarry is one of the most tragic victims, because McGarry's house in Fairview was burnt by a party of IRA men from the 2nd Battalion, and his young son, Emmett McGarry, 7 years old, was inside and died in the blaze. And his wife was badly injured. And I mean, Sean McGarry is visiting him in hospital, and he's drinking to drown his sorrows afterwards. And there was another attempt to assassinate McGarry. So contrary to what Henderson said, they did actually try to kill him, and they blew up his shop. He had a shop in the city centre, which they later blew up with explosives. Now, McGarry is part of this IRB group, who the Anti-Treatyites kind of blamed for the treaty. There's a lot of personal kind of animus there. I guess that is quite reckless. On the other hand, I mean, in the wake of all this, there was another auxiliary police unit formed called the Protective Corps, and they were put guarding ministers, TDs, supporters around Dublin, including the likes of, for example, Jenny Weiss-Power, who was the head of the pro-treaty women's group, Cumann na Saoirse, and various other newspaper editors, members of the gentry, who the Anti-Treatyites kind of took it out on. After this point, quite a lot of the pro-treaty activity, certainly in Dublin, was involved in protecting their supporters from anti-treaty attacks.
Well, from doing so much research on the Anti-Treaty IRA in Dublin, does this strike you as this campaign, as the Anti-Treaty IRA have lost their way, that they're out of ideas, or is there brutal logic to the strategy that they're pursuing?
When you're talking about the Irish Civil War, there's kind of two ways to think about it. There's what makes sense at the time in the immediate circumstances. So, in the immediate circumstances, there's a certain brutal logic to it, in the sense that had they been ruthless enough with this, had they really followed through with Lynch's orders and killed everybody who voted for the Public Safety Act, the government could have collapsed, or the government would have been pushed to even more severe measures. But there's a chance the government would have collapsed had they followed through on that. Now, that's true of the anti-treaty campaign as a whole. I mean, whereas it's often depicted as kind of irrational and a type of madness, actually there was a plan, which was to wreck the economy and wreck the tax base of the Free State, and it would collapse, and they'd have to renegotiate the treaty. On those tactical terms, on the terms that the likes of Liam Lynch was thinking on, it makes sense. Now, with the Civil War as a whole, and with the Assassination campaign in particular, step back a little bit from it, and it makes no sense at all. I mean, in the sense that these are people who should really all be on the same side. They've fallen out over basically a factional disagreement over the treaty. And the logical end result of all this will just be division, disunity, death. It's really not going to achieve anything. The only thing that I'll say in their defence is that once you're in these situations, once you're in a conflict, it's very difficult to take the step back. You probably only see things in terms of winning and losing.
And did the Hales family themselves ever write or talk about the Seán Hales assassination?
It's funny, Donald Hales left a witness statement into the Bureau of Military History later on, and Donald Hales was an anti-treatyite. And funny enough, I mean, he mentions our poor brother Seán was killed, but he talks more about the executions, and he lodged letters of protest with the Pope and so forth, and tried to encourage the Pope to send an envoy, which he did, Nuncio, to protest at the executions. So, I assume the Hales family grieved in private, but politically they happened to be on the other side. One other thing to add, I mean, I've talked about the role of the likes of Michael Carolan, Owen Donnelly, Bobby Bonfield, people like that, Sean Carfrey, people who we now know who were involved. But this was a secret for many, many years. Now, the likes of, for example, Owen Donnelly never applied for a pension, because in the pension statement he would have had to say what he did. In 1924, Eamon de Valera, confidentially, it's in his papers, asked Frank Aiken, by this time the IRA Chief of Staff, who killed Seán Hales. And de Valera is the chief, he's the head of the anti-treaty political movement, and Frank Aiken won't tell him. Frank Aiken writes back, it was the ASU, the Active Service Unit of the Dublin Brigade, and I take full responsibility as Chief of Staff. And he says no more. So we now can piece together who was involved and so forth. No one ever wanted to take the credit, if you like, for it. It was a deep, dark secret for many years. Richard Mulcahy, in his papers, there's a long portfolio where he tries to find who did it, and he gets nowhere. He has no idea who did it, and basically he blames de Valera, and he traces all things back that de Valera said about how the Dáil was illegitimate and so forth, and he says this legitimised the killing of a TD. But it's one of the Civil War's deep, dark secrets that I think it's time to bring out into the open.
Well, thank you very much, John. That was very interesting. And as you say there, the Bureau of Military History witness statements, they just treasure trove of information, and they're all transcribed and online.
That's right.
Well, thanks very much, John. And as the listeners will know, John's been writing a book and researching for a very long time about the Civil War in Dublin. So it's not out yet. It should be out Christmas 2017, do you think?
It'll be out before Christmas 2017, yeah.
All our listeners, you should really keep a lookout for that, Dublin's Civil War. So if you want to listen to any previous episodes of the show on our website, that's irishhistoryshow.ie. You can like us on Facebook on facebook.com/The Irish History Show, or you can follow us on Twitter @IrishHistoryPod. My name is Cathal Brennan, and for myself and John Doherty, thanks for listening.